So Coach Ulbrichtsen's job was definitely on the line in 1936. It was clear that he was going to lose his position if he didn't at least get his crew to Berlin, if not win the gold medal. Ulbrichtsen was a man of few words often. He could be very tough. He was often hard on the young men that rode for him. But he also was kind of a genius. He understood that putting a great crew together involves a kind of alchemy. It involves mixing and matching different personality types and different physical types to find a formula that actually makes the boat go faster. And he experimented in the spring of 1936 a lot with the JV boat, putting boys in, taking boys out, trying to find just that magical combination of strengths that would cut the would make the day in Berlin. And he finally found it actually when he added Joe Rance to the boat quite late that spring. It's amazing to realize that in the 1930s, on a given Saturday afternoon, 60, 70, 80,000 people might turn out for a crew race on Lake Washington in Seattle or on the Hudson River in New York or any number of places across the country. It was an enormously popular spectator sport. It was also a sport that drew a lot of national attention from the press. Crew races were covered coast to coast by the major papers. Coxswain's sore throat could make headlines in the newspapers. Prominent oarsmen found their faces on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post and other magazines, and millions of dollars were spent betting on the outcome of these races. Pocock was, in many ways, I think, the crew's secret ingredient or character behind the curtain. Pocock, as Ulbrichtsen in some ways was the bad cop, in some ways Pocock was the good cop. As I say, Ulbrichtsen could be very hard on the boys. He was hard to predict. George Pocock was sort of a Yoda-like figure to these young men. He was wise, he was well-read, he was always full of pithy and interesting pieces of advice. And he was willing to share that advice with these young men. So oftentimes, if they were down because of what Ulbrichtsen had told them, they'd go find Pocock. Pocock would remind them in one way or another by telling a story or whatever he would remind them of what they were capable of. So he was an inspiration to them. And he was an inspiration not just to the 36 crew, but to generations of rowers at the University of Washington. You know, this story is one of the rare times when I've been researching a book that as the more I dug into the story, the more incredible it became. Oftentimes when you start researching a book, it just sort of fizzles out or isn't as rich a possibility as you thought it might be. This story, as I dug into it and I discovered characters like George Pocock and the influence he had on the crew and the improbability of Don Hume, the stroke oar, getting sick just before the final race, and all these little plot points and twists that I couldn't have contrived if I was a writer of fiction were already there for me as a writer. So it was a wonderful sort of voyage of exploration for me to uncover the story. And it's remarkable. There are lots of twists in the story. A lot of unexpected things came up. I think it reads as well as good fiction, absolutely. Seeing the film for the first time was a remarkable experience. I didn't know what to expect. I was a little nervous. I hadn't really had much role in shaping it. So So I was sitting there, I was quite nervous. The film began to roll, and we watched it, and I'd say about halfway into the film, I started liking it right away. Then about halfway into the film, I could hear my wife sniffling next to me, and that's always a really good sign. And then by 10 minutes later, I was sniffling and wiping tears away, and Sharon, my wife, was wiping tears away. So, so I knew right then and there that if it could touch me, I'm somebody that knows this story inside out. I've been living with it for over 10 years now. I'm pretty confident that if it can touch me and touch my wife, it's going to touch a lot of viewers. It really does resonate well. So I think this, for me, this story is important in our time, primarily because I see it as a sort of metaphor for, first of all, for that generation of Americans who lived through the Depression, who literally had to learn to pull together simply to survive first the Depression and then get through World War II. They were literally all found themselves, maybe not literally, metaphorically, found themselves in the same boat at the beginning of the Great Depression. So they had to learn to pull together. So for me, the story ultimately is a metaphor for that generation's ability to persevere, to pull together, to get things done. But then also, I think it's a lesson, an object lesson for my generations and younger generations to look at and say, wow, these guys had some wisdom, and it was wisdom born of really hard experiences, but it's wisdom worth paying attention to.